Kazakhstan ranks 157th in the World Press Freedom Index. The state control over the freedom of speech in modernizing and moves on online space, seeking to censor and control internet. Bloggers, opinion makers and social media users are being silenced with long-term prison sentences and confinement to psychiatric clinics. We are alerted and deeply concerned about the shrinking space of civil society, particularly the cases of several human rights organizations. Those activities were suspended and fined on alleged violations and the crackdown against the independent trade unions. Even more worrisome situation is the peaceful opposition movements, Democratic Choice of Kazakhstan and Koche Partiyasi, as their members and supporters dominate the list of political prisoners. Last year, 5 political activists, including Dulat Agadil and his 17-year-old son, have died as a result of illegal actions and political repression by law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Human rights defenders in Kazakhstan are under constant intimidation, harassment and threat of criminal charges. For example, Elena Semenova is being persecuted for exposing torture in prisons. Raigul Sadirbayeva for helping activists to defend their rights. Anna Shukeyeva and her husband Burzan Aturbayev for aiding politically prosecuted persons. Recent actions of Kazakh government, when few political prisoners were released, the fines and suspension of activities for several NGOs were removed, is much welcome, but does not fulfill its commitments. It must be clear that the European Union seeks for cooperation with Kazakhstan, but puts respect for human rights and democracy above economic gains.
30 years ago, when Kazakhstan, as the last remaining Soviet republic, declared independence and effectively ended the Union, the hope was high that the new republic would embrace democracy and build an effective statehood. The hope was high that people of Kazakhstan who suffered on the nuclear site in Semipalatinsk would now be granted fundamental rights and a chance for a dignified life. All these hopes were crushed by 30 years of Nazarbayev's dictatorship. Not a single fair election was held under his rule. Corruption flourished, freedom of speech was severely restricted, opposition imprisoned, protests of mine workers brutally suppressed, and journalists terrorized and murdered. Now Nazarbayev's successor promised to do a better job in controlled democratization. At one glance, party registration has been simplified, participation in protests partially allowed, death penalty was recently abolished, and regions were given a bit more of self-governance. Yet the recent deterioration of human rights questions the real efforts of the new president. The key OSCE recommendations were ignored during the last parliamentary elections. Censorship was tightened and internet surveillance reached dystopian level. Hundreds of peaceful protesters were illegally detained. The practice of harassing, assaulting and arresting of journalists was continued. Women and girls still suffer greatly despite introduction of mandatory quotas on electoral list, not to speak about the terrible situation for women in detention centers. The government cracked down on the civil sector, trade unions and human rights organizations. Prisoners are still being tortured and the number of political prisoners started to rise again. The EU is based on the respect of fundamental rights and principles. Therefore, the economic cooperation with Kazakhstan, which has a huge potential, can only be advanced on condition of respecting our fundamental values. Human rights are not for sale. Thank you.